Jordan Peterson's conversation with Muhammad Hijab takes place in a mosque, a setting that already signals something important. This is not merely an academic exchange, but a deeply religious encounter. Hijab approaches the discussion with clear intent, hoping to move Peterson toward Islam, while Peterson enters as a thinker who resists being boxed into doctrinal commitments. What unfolds is not a clash of personalities, but a clash of fundamentally different ways of understanding truth, reason, and faith. As the conversation begins, Hijab establishes familiarity and respect by emphasizing that he has studied Peterson's work carefully. This opening move is strategic. It frames the discussion as thoughtful and informed, while also positioning Hijab as someone qualified to challenge Peterson on his own intellectual ground. Yet beneath this courtesy lies a deeper aim: to revisit Peterson's long-standing discomfort with Christian doctrine and to test whether that discomfort still remains.
I've read all your books, and I even read some of your peer-reviewed work, because when I was going to speak to you, then I said, you know what, I'm going to do my homework. Yeah. So I read everything.
Hijab immediately directs the conversation toward Peterson's early rejection of Christianity, particularly his struggle with Genesis and its apparent tension with scientific narratives. This is not an incidental detail. In Islamic apologetics, Christianity is often portrayed as intellectually incoherent at its foundations, and Hijab is preparing the ground for that critique by revisiting Peterson's adolescent crisis of faith. Peterson's response is measured and reflective. He does not deny his earlier skepticism, nor does he claim to have fully resolved it. Instead, he frames his journey as an ongoing struggle, one that pits Enlightenment rationality against inherited religious narrative. Importantly, Peterson does not present himself as having solved theology, but as someone still attempting to reconcile competing modes of meaning.
One of the things that you said one time in The Maps of Meaning, you started off the book by saying, when you were a young lad, I don't know how young you were, you said that you found the doctrines of Christianity incomprehensible and absurd, yeah? And you also said that you found you had some kind of issue with Christianity because of the Genesis narrative and how incongruent it was with scientific narratives. You went to a pastor, you said, or a church cleric or something, and then you left the church. Now, I've got a question. Do you still have the same position, or have you changed your position?
Well, I've changed my position a lot. I was only 13 then, you know, and I was caught up in the battle, you know, insofar it was manifested in me when I was 13. I was caught in the battle between Enlightenment rationality and traditional narrative belief. I had no idea how to reconcile those two things.
Peterson's admission that he is doing his best to reconcile rationality and tradition is significant. It reveals a posture of humility rather than dogmatism. But Hijab does not accept this tension as legitimate. Instead, he interprets Peterson's youthful rejection of Christian doctrine as evidence of clear thinking rather than confusion. From Hijab's perspective, Christian theology itself, not Peterson's reasoning, was the problem. This is where the conversation begins to sharpen. Hijab introduces the doctrine of the Trinity as his central example, framing it as logically incoherent and incompatible with pure monotheism. His argument follows a familiar Islamic critique that three divine persons necessarily imply either contradiction or polytheism.
Do you feel like you can do that now?
I'm doing my best to reconcile.
So let me be
yes, and I think, well, I certainly can do it a lot more than I did when I was 13.
Let me give you an example, right?
Hijab's critique escalates as he contrasts divine mystery with logical contradiction. From his standpoint, doctrines such as the Trinity and the dual nature of Christ are not merely mysterious, but fundamentally irrational. He frames this not as a theological disagreement, but as a violation of logic itself. Peterson, however, refuses to play the game on those terms. When pressed to prioritize rational consistency above all else, he makes a striking admission. Rationality, in his view, is not ultimate. It must be subordinated to something higher. This is a crucial moment. Peterson is not rejecting reason. He is placing it within a broader framework of meaning that cannot be reduced to propositional logic.
This point, when you were 13, I think you were thinking straight. I'll be sorry to be very straight.
It's hard to believe that someone is disagreeable with you as you would manage that.
Because someone with an IQ of 180 or whatever you have, yeah, someone of your intelligence. When you were 13, you probably had an IQ of, I don't know, 120 or something, yeah? So you were operating like my friend over here, 𝗙𝗿𝗶𝗁𝗨𝘀𝗲, so it's on his level, at the age of 13. But what I was going to say was that, the reason why I think he was, because look at the Trinity, for example. Look at the schisms. Now, this goes to your specialism. The idea of three all-powerful entities, that Jesus is all-powerful, that the Father is all-powerful, the Son is all-powerful, and the Holy Spirit is all-powerful, but there's not three all-powerfuls, there's one all-powerful. You have one ultimately willing being, person, which is Jesus, and then another person, which is ultimately willing, which is the Son. The Quran says about this, it says, مَا اتَّخَذَ اللَّهُ مِنْ وَلَدٍ وَمَا كَانَ مَعَهُ مِنْ إِلَهٍ إِذًا لَذَهَبَ كُلُّ إِلَهٍ بِمَا خَلَقَ وَلَعَلَ بَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ. In chapter 23, verse number 91, it says that Allah has not taken any son, and he did not have any creator with him. Had that been the case, they would have stripped one another for what they would have competed and tried to outstrip one another for power. Meaning this idea of three all-powerful persons is unintelligible, to say the least. The idea that Jesus Christ exhibits two natures. I know that there are schisms and there's difference of opinion among Christians, but the fact that you have this human nature.
As Hijab continues, he frames Christian doctrine as a source of inevitable cognitive dissonance. In his view, anyone committed to rational inquiry must eventually abandon such beliefs. Yet, Peterson's reply cuts in a different direction altogether. He does not deny the tension. Instead, he questions whether theological truth should be judged primarily by intellectual satisfaction. For Peterson, reducing transcendence to a purely analytical exercise strips it of its depth. Theology, when flattened into debate points and logical propositions, becomes something less than what it claims to describe. This is why Peterson loses interest as the discussion moves deeper into doctrinal disputation. Not because the questions are unimportant, but because they miss what he believes is most essential.
Where Jesus is walking and he sees the tree and he can't eat from the tree. He doesn't know that the tree is in season or not, or that he doesn't know when the hour is, or whatever it may be. The Quran says it very clearly. كَانَا يَأْكُلَانِ الطَّعَامِ. Him and his mom used to eat food. This proposition that they're limited and unlimited at the same time is it's a contradiction. It's an affront to logic. This will cause you cognitive dissonance. Because if you want to be a rational actor and you want to be...
that's the thing.
Yeah.
I don't want to be a rational actor.
But you do when you do your scientific experiments.
That's true.
So why do you separate the two things?
Because rationality should be subordinated to something above it.
This exchange reveals the deepest divide between the two men. Hijab treats rational coherence as the ultimate criterion of truth. Peterson treats meaning, embodiment, and lived transformation as equally, if not more, important. They are not merely disagreeing about doctrine. They are operating with different definitions of what it means to know something at all. At this point, Peterson openly states that he finds the discussion less compelling as it moves into abstract theological debate. He is not dismissing theology itself, but signaling that his interest lies elsewhere, in the symbolic, existential, and transformative dimensions of faith, rather than in doctrinal precision.
And I'm trying to subordinate myself to that. And so my reaction to what you're saying is that this isn't an insult.
Yeah,
I'm telling you what my reaction is.
Please say
it's not even a criticism.
Of course.
I find that discussion, as soon as it started, I found that less interesting than what we were doing before. It was harder for me to focus on. And I think the reason for that is that it transforms to some, and I'm not saying this isn't necessary at sometimes, but it transforms the transcendent into something like an intellectual and propositional discussion. And so in some sense, we're debating perhaps not the fine points of theology, because they're more like the blunt points of theology.
I understand.
But there's something about that that isn't what I want to do with you.
Yes.
And it isn't that it's not necessary.
Here, the conversation reaches a natural pause. We can already see that this is not simply a debate about Christianity versus Islam, but a deeper disagreement about how truth itself is encountered and lived. As the discussion continues, Peterson will shift the focus away from abstract doctrine and toward the figure of Christ, asking why Jesus occupies such a central place across religious traditions. With that in mind, let us now move forward and listen carefully to the next stage of this conversation, where the question of Jesus takes center stage.
So let me flip it around to some degree. So one of the things I'm very curious about is, obviously, the figure of Christ is contentious.
Yes.
And so the Jews don't know what to make of Christ in some fundamental sense, because he seems like a continuation of the prophetic tradition in some real sense, plus he was Jewish, so that makes things complicated. And then, of course, the Christians put the figure of Christ as central in some real sense, but that begs the question of the relationship between Christ and God. And then in the Muslim community, Christ is also a central figure. And so I'm curious about that, and we could say we have doctrinal differences about what constitutes that centrality. It's like, fair enough, and I would also not say that I understand what that centrality means.
At this stage, the conversation takes a decisive turn. Rather than continuing to debate abstract doctrines or logical formulations of God, Jordan Peterson redirects the discussion toward a single, unavoidable figure, Jesus Christ. This shift is not accidental. Peterson understands that Jesus occupies a unique position in human history, one that cannot be dismissed simply by labeling doctrines as irrational or mysterious. By reframing the discussion around Jesus rather than theological systems, Peterson exposes something deeper: the shared tension across Judaism, Christianity, and Islam regarding the identity and significance of Christ. Each tradition acknowledges him, yet none interprets him in the same way. This alone raises a profound question: why does this figure refuse to remain peripheral?
And I know that in the Western tradition, that's part of what has been conceptualized as the fundamental attribute of the figure of Christ. And I know that Christ is central in the Muslim tradition. And so one of the things I would want to know is, why do you believe that the figure of Christ is central in some sense? Or maybe I've got that wrong, although I don't think so. Why do you think the figure of Christ is central both to the Muslim faith and the Christian faith? And what do you think that says about what we share in common? Because I really don't understand that.
Peterson is not asserting a doctrine here. He is asking a phenomenological question. Why does Christ remain central even in traditions that reject his divinity? In doing so, he subtly reframes the issue. The question is no longer whether Christians can logically explain the Trinity, but why Jesus refuses to disappear from the religious consciousness of humanity. This line of inquiry places Islam in an interesting position. Islam explicitly denies Christ's divinity, yet grants him an extraordinary status, affirming his virgin birth, miracles, moral authority, and even his return at the end of time. Peterson presses into this tension, not to trap hijab, but to understand what lies beneath it.
So Jesus Christ, if secular historians will look at him and differ on his existence or not, the majority, to be fair, do believe he existed, right? Even secular historians, atheists and agnostics and whatever it may be, right?
It's the simplest explanation.
Yeah, it's a simple, of course, yeah. So I believe that, first of all, Jesus Christ existed, which in the modern age is worth noting, right? Muslims are the only other major world religion who believe in Jesus Christ as the Messiah, as the prophet.
Right,
he had the virgin
and
birth.
this is a strange thing, so we should definitely be trying to sort that out.
All right, so this is the first point of commonality. We believe in Jesus Christ. We believe in his miracles, that he cured the blind with God's permission, that he raised the dead with God's permission. We believe that he even, he created some things which in the Gospel of Thomas not mentioned in the Bible, like, for example, the clay bird and so on, that he blew into it and it became an actual bird, that he cured the leper with God's permission. We believe that he was one of the mightiest human beings that have ever lived on the earth. And we believe that his mother was the best woman who ever lived on the earth. The Quran actually explicitly says that.
Well, that seems like a good starting point.
Hijab responds by emphasizing historical consensus. Before doctrine, before theology, before faith claims, Jesus existed. This is an important move. By grounding the discussion in history, hijab establishes common ground not only with Christians, but with secular scholars as well. Jesus is not a mythological abstraction. He is a historical problem that every worldview must address. From the Islamic perspective, this historical Jesus is reinterpreted within a strictly monotheistic framework. Jesus is affirmed as Messiah and prophet, endowed with miracles by God's permission, yet firmly distinguished from God himself. Hijab presents this as a rational and coherent alternative to Christian theology. Hijab outlines Islam's view of Jesus with clarity and confidence. Jesus is honored, revered, and elevated, but always as a servant of God. His miracles are real, yet derivative. His greatness is undeniable, yet bounded. This preserves divine transcendence while allowing Jesus extraordinary status. Peterson listens carefully. His response is not one of immediate objection, but of reflection. What strikes him is not merely that Islam acknowledges Jesus, but that nearly every major worldview feels compelled to explain him in some way. For Peterson, this universality demands attention. It suggests that Jesus is not merely a theological construct, but a symbolic and historical axis around which human meaning turns.
I want to ask you a question just before we end.
Yeah, sure.
Is that
I've
okay?
only politely sat here just to indicate we need to wrap up.
Okay, I just want to ask one last question, because I'm interested in both of you in a sense, yeah? I said that, from a Muslim perspective, the question that we're asked to ask is, bring the evidence, yeah? If I were to bring reasonable evidence, which would satisfy some kind of probabilistic reasoning, that the Prophet Muhammad, we believe is the final prophet, right? That he was a true prophet, would you be willing to become a Muslim?
I wouldn't dispute a priori the idea that Muhammad was a true prophet.
Okay.
But I don't understand what that means.
So
obviously, so this is the way I'm going to look at this psychologically again. It's people are granted revelations, and it's obviously the case, let's speak empirically, that the revelation of Muhammad united a fractious society. And so it was a uniting revelation. Now, how to conceptualize, but it's not a universally uniting revelation, at least not yet or not now, because we're not all united. So why? Well, maybe we didn't understand the revelation properly. That's one possibility.
Is the presupposition what you're saying that unity is the ultimate objective?
Well, not exactly, because then you have the problem of uniformity that you pointed out.
Even the idea of unity itself. I mean, is there not...
Well, we talked about,
unity is a great, just to be clear, I believe that unity is a great objective, but I don't think it's the all-defining one. For example, if there is an injustice that is so great that disunity is more appropriate, then I can imagine situations where disunity is probably better than unity.
Right.
I'm sure you can as well. For example, like in the Soviet Union.
That would be a false unity in some sense,
exactly.
Right?
So that's what we're talking about.
Well, that's why you wanted to address the elephant under the carpet right away.
Exactly.
We can't have a false peace.
Exactly.
And we can't incorporate things we can't yet incorporate.
Yes. The reason why I'm bringing this to your attention is because I feel like it's my duty as a Muslim, especially in the mosque, right, to tell you that as Muslims, we believe that the previous dispensations, as they were like Christianity and Judaism, they are part of our faith in a sense. Not in the sense of believing the doctrines and all of that kind of thing. Like, we obviously don't believe in original sin or the resurrection, the crucifixion, all this kind of thing. We don't believe in any of that. Or the Trinity, of course. But in the sense that we do believe in Jesus Christ, we believe in all of the Old Testament prophets, most of them, if not all of them, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and so on.
I don't understand the question exactly.
He wants to know if you will convert to Islam.
No, I'm saying that, that wasn't...
I mean, that's the question. Well, look, I would say to some degree, it's not up to me.
But my question was, just to remind you, the question was, if I gave you evidence that would satisfy a certain level of probabilistic...
No.
Peterson broadens the scope of the conversation. He lists how different religions interpret Jesus: judge of the world, enlightened teacher, divine avatar, revolutionary manifestation of God. None of these interpretations are identical, yet none dismiss him outright. This convergence does not prove divinity, as Peterson openly admits, but it raises a question that refuses to go away. Why Jesus? For Peterson, the persistence of Christ across cultures and centuries points to something deeper than doctrine. It points to a profound symbolic reality embedded in the human psyche and in history itself.
No, because that isn't how I evaluate the situation.
How would you evaluate it?
Well, for me, the proof of faith is the attractiveness of its adherents. And that's something to think about, right? Well, are you a shining example of the Muslim faith? Well, how hard do you shine?
As the discussion approaches its conclusion, hijab shifts from explanation to invitation. The tone changes. This is no longer merely an exchange of ideas. It becomes an overt call to conversion. Hijab frames the question in terms of evidence and probability, asking whether sufficient proof would compel Peterson to become Muslim. Peterson's answer is revealing. He does not reject Muhammad outright, nor does he deny the unifying power of Islamic revelation. Instead, he questions the criteria by which religious truth should be evaluated. For him, faith is not proven by arguments alone, but by the moral and existential fruit it produces. When Peterson says that the proof of faith is the attractiveness of its adherents, he delivers perhaps the most unsettling moment of the conversation. This is not a philosophical abstraction. It is a moral challenge. Peterson is not asking whether Islam can be defended intellectually, but whether it manifests itself in a way that draws people toward peace, unity, and transformation. The conversation ends not with resolution, but with exposure. It exposes the limits of rational debate, the tension between unity and truth, and the difficulty of translating revelation into lived reality. In the final analysis, this conversation is not about winning an argument. It is about two fundamentally different visions of faith. One emphasizes doctrinal clarity and rational coherence. The other emphasizes symbolic depth, moral transformation, and lived meaning. Jordan Peterson does not convert, nor does Muhammad Hijab abandon his convictions. Instead, what remains is a stark and honest tension, one that mirrors the broader dialogue between Islam and Christianity today. The question left hanging is not merely which theology is correct, but what kind of faith can truly shape human life toward truth, justice, and peace. With that, we come to the end of this exchange. Let us now step back and reflect on what has been said, and consider carefully what this conversation reveals, not only about religion, but about the way we seek meaning itself.